Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Dissenter Weekly for August 20th. Brian is not able to join me this week, so before we get rolling, I would like to encourage you to hit the red subscribe button below this video to follow our show. And remember that Shadowproof is a 100% reader-funded and supported website. Our ability to do this show depends on your financial support. If you want to help us sustain this show and grow as an organization, please check out our donation and membership options at shadowproof.com/donate. So I only have one story for this week. I'm doing a shorter show, but I'm trying this new feature to see how it might incorporate into the show. And it involves bringing my screen into this. And I know for some of you who have watched very well-produced videos from your favorite podcasters, etc., you've seen the screen sharing capability used. You might think I'm being silly here, but we've just never tried it during production, and I don't have any assistants to help me if this goes wrong. So bear with me as I go through this. But the big story that I want to focus on, this will be the only story we cover in this shorter show this week, is the freak out over Trump considering a pardon for Edward Snowden. This is something that needs a lot of comment, I believe, especially because of the backlash that happened when he merely mentioned it on Saturday. It was 5 or 6 days ago. He was asked about it because it has come up as there are a handful of conservative representatives who are in favor of it. In fact, Senator Rand Paul is in favor of a pardon for NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. This is something, by the way, that has been supported by the ACLU and some other privacy and civil liberties organizations that have pushed for a pardon. When Barack Obama was president and you had the end of his administration in 2016, and in that period, that lame duck period, there was an effort to get a pardon for Snowden then. And so there's now this idea, because Donald Trump merely mentioned that he's considering it. And in fact, it's not even evident that he has put much thought into how he feels about this case at this moment. Just because he mentioned it at a press conference, there was this incredible freak out among elites. Primarily, they would probably fall into the category of neoliberals or neoconservatives. And I wanted, and I tracked their reaction, and it compares it's very similar to the prejudice that existed in 2013 when Edward Snowden came forward and revealed himself. And back then, we had a cross-section of people who saw him as somebody who had betrayed his country, especially when he became trapped in Moscow. And for the record, he ended up in Moscow when he left Hong Kong because his passport was revoked by the State Department. So continuously, the way that he is critiqued and or attacked comes back to the idea that he somehow become a pawn of Russia President Vladimir Putin. And that's definitely become the defining characteristic for how opponents of Trump view everything that the Trump administration does. And so what happened is this backlash unfolded, and the possibility that Snowden might get a pardon became folded into this entrenched idea that somehow Russia is constantly influencing the Trump administration, and this might be part of it. But I do find that funny, because if it is the case that Trump is doing this to appeal to the Russian government for whatever reason, well, one, I don't think that's actually in Russia's interest to give up Snowden. I think it's a chip that can be played by Russia at any moment. And for right now, it makes them look pretty good to have someone who is a whistleblower who exposed mass surveillance by the NSA in their country to hold up and show that the United States really isn't as fair and free as it claims to be, and we are in fact giving a asylum to a whistleblower who showed that there was massive violations of civil liberties going on in the United States and against people around the world. And so I don't think it's really in their interest to give him up unless they're getting something in return from Donald Trump's administration. So I don't think that's the case, but I also don't think it would look the way that it looks right now, where there's indecision and Trump isn't sure what he plans to do. And that makes sense, because if you go back to the early, if you go back to 2013 and 2014, it was believed by Trump that this made the Obama administration look weak, that they weren't able to protect secrets, and that there was someone who was out there behaving. And as the conventional wisdom is among elites, they usually treat someone like Edward Snowden as a spy, someone who is not engaged in revealing information that'll make the public know more about something that they deserve to know about, but in fact suggesting that they are behaving like an alleged spy. And so there's this huge uproar. And before we get to what those were, I also think that in order to mock and document this freakout, we have to understand what Edward Snowden disclosed, or we have to refresh our memories about what Edward Snowden disclosed. So everyone's fairly familiar with the bulk records collection program that was discontinued or altered because of him. We found that all these phone records were being collected. There was the PRISM program that was collecting internet records, and in fact, there's a list that I found. There's a timeline that does a really good job of documenting what was revealed by Edward Snowden. And in fact, it's over at the Lawfare blog, which I found surprising because the editors and people involved have been very cozy with former NSA officials before. This is a Beltway kind of operation. And yet the Lawfare blog is actually, this first that I knew of this, cataloged all of these revelations into a very useful timeline. And one of the few places on the internet where you can find this kind of easily accessible timeline of what was revealed. But, the NSA had a treasure map that was mapping the global internet. There was a program the NSA had called Monster Mind that was basically going to automatically respond to cyber attacks from other countries without human intervention. So escalations of cyber war potential. There was X Keyscore, which was going after internet traffic, monitoring the internet in Europe and the African continent. Apparently, GCHQ was involved in the manipulation of online polls and inflating website views and promoting or disrupting videos on YouTube. We had that NSA was building a database of facial images and developing facial recognition technology to analyze those images. You had that there was a malware implanted. There were routers and servers that NSA was working to modify before being exported overseas that would facilitate intelligence collection. You also had the fact that they were targeting foreign officials, trying to spy on them. There were NSA targets that probably shouldn't have been pursued. People who were like the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, a former Bush administration official with a top secret clearance was targeted at one point. It was revealed that Muslim American leaders were targets. There were targeting happening 193 countries, the World Bank, the IMF, the European Union. There were people who were being spied on in political parties in Pakistan and Egypt and in Venezuela. In the Bahamas, there was massive collection of cell phone calls. There were entire countries in which the communications of those citizens were being swept up. And I imagine they're still being collected today because we haven't seen reform on that. We saw revelations about surveillance on WikiLeaks, which I cover extensively. And so he revealed all this stuff about the nature to which there were targeting of foreign officials. Remember Angela Merkel's phone was monitored. That was a scandal that Barack Obama had to deal with. And all of this upset greatly the Obama administration. And of course, it upset conservatives. And then now we find that we've got this coalition leading the way that is deeply upset with the possibility that Edward Snowden might be pardoned. And in fact, we've seen an op-ed that was published in the Washington Post by former Republican Representative Mike Rogers, who was involved in a leadership position in the House Intelligence Committee and the Dutch Ruppersberger. And these are political stewards of intelligence agencies. They do what they can to protect the agencies from any kind of reform, any restrictions on their activities. And the Washington Post published this column, and the Washington Post is a newspaper that published reports that exposed revelations from Edward Snowden. So, yeah, I always love U.S. media that is in the business of attacking their sources as a service to U.S. security agencies. It's a nice feature of the press in the United States, where they feel like they have to always make it clear that they respect and support the overclassification and the concealing of abuses by security agents, even as they publish those materials themselves. And fortunately for them, they are able to maintain an equilibrium, so they think, where only their sources are punished, but they don't speak up for those sources, especially as they live in exile and cannot return home. And they encourage putting them on trial and not giving them the credit or praise that they deserve, because the government wants to prosecute them for revealing classified information. So let's go to this screen here. And so the first one that I have here is from Susan Rice. And this was the reaction that got quite a lot of attention from people, because it was Susan Rice who was just being very glib about this development and saying, congratulations, GOP, this is who you are now. And it's not really the case that this is reflective of the GOP. In fact, the GOP doesn't want Snowden to come back to the United States and be forgiven for disclosing this information. And by the way, Susan Rice, it's actually kind of stunning that she's, of the people who we're going to see here, she did not attribute this suggestion that he would consider a pardon, did not attribute this to the Russian government being involved in meddling in the Trump administration. She's somebody who suggested, after the protests following George Floyd's murder by the Minneapolis police, she's someone who suggested that the Russians could be behind the riots that were happening on the streets, and that this wasn't organic discontent and outrage from people who are fed up with police having impunity and not being held accountable for their actions. And she's someone who's been quick to see Russia behind a lot of different things. So to just make this about the GOP, I suppose this is who you are now, is the fact that, she's suggesting implicitly that they are catering to a foreign power that is against America, Russia. But honestly, the GOP is not on board with this. And so the next one that we have here is this is from Bill Kristol, who said, just noting that Trump seems a lot more concerned for Edward Snowden, whom Putin is harboring, than American troops whom Putin is targeting. And what Bill Kristol is referring to, and by the way, Bill Kristol is the person who was involved in the Project for the New American Century, neoconservative pundit, somebody who came out very hard for the Iraq War, pushing and creating the case for it and defending it afterwards. As late as 2015, he was still defending it as something that needed to happen, and excusing the results, which would include the fact that ISIS was unleashed all throughout the region as a result of the Bush administration's actions. And so, here he is suggesting this question, which he thinks is like a provocative thought that people need to consider. Except the problem with this is it was a scandal on the part of the media to fall for the Afghan intelligence agencies pushing material into the news in the last month or two that there were bounties from Russia offered to the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers. This bounty story has been proven to be not substantiated. And Gareth Porter did a magnificent report, and I did an interview with him for my weekly podcast, Unauthorized Disclosure, talking to him, where we broke down how this was obviously a maneuver by people within the Pentagon to extend the Afghanistan war and prevent a withdrawal, so that war that has gone on for almost 20 years, they're still keeping going and justifying it with bogus intelligence, which obviously is something that Bill Kristol is quite comfortable with, given his connection to pushing the Iraq war that was based entirely upon lies about Saddam Hussein's regime that did not turn out to be true at all. And he knew that they were false, but he just doesn't care. And Jennifer Rubin is another hawk who came out and pointed out that the GOP used to be cold warriors, and now they're praising a traitor and let Putin get away with targeting our troops. And again, that bounty story was completely false. And in fact, the GOP is not exactly on board with ending the Cold War, or they're not on board with being servants of Russia. That's just nuts. And now we have Barry McCaffrey, who in fact is a remarkable individual to hear from in all of this, because Barry McCaffrey is a retired U.S. Army general who was part of President Clinton's administration. And so when he says, so Putin wants Snowden pardoned, the world turned upside down, what do the Russians have on Trump? This is a person who should be entirely discredited, and nobody should be sharing what he has to say, because he's a military propagandist who was involved in a scandal exposed by the New York Times around the Iraq War back in 2008. There were retired journalists that were hired to provide commentary at ABC, CBS, and NBC to make their case for the Iraq War. They also had undisclosed ties to contractors that benefited from the invasion and occupation. This was around the invasion and the occupation of the Iraq War. So we see a lot of what we're talking about here comes from people who our society has not made persona non grata or has not cast out, despite their role in pushing for the mass killing and the warfare that we saw in Iraq, and to just come back and continue to push more and more for these kinds of things. So we've got Sam Vinograd here, who is a contributor to CNN, and again making the same kind of glib remarks here, wondering who gave him the idea to pardon Snowden. We see that we've got a joke here because they're funny, and this is basically Russia delusion humor. Did it come up in a Pootie call? And that's about what you could expect from these people these days. If you look at this is Oren Kerr, who is a part of the Volokh conspiracy at Washington Post, or was, and then that blog moved to Reason, and he's allegedly concerned with privacy rights and constitutional law, and here he is engaging in neo-McCarthyism against pardoning someone who's done more to expose how our privacy rights were being systematically violated in the last decade than anybody else. So then we've got Hunter Walker, who is with the Business Insider, And he does this thing that I loathe, where he's pitting whistleblowers against each other. And it's important for us to not do that. And so I wonder why the president thinks Ed Snowden might deserve a pardon, but Reality Winner apparently doesn't. Well, both deserve a pardon. Let's not play this game. If Reality Winner can get out of the prison and no longer be vulnerable to COVID-19, we want that right now. And this show has advocated for that. And also, Edward Snowden should receive a pardon so he can come back home and no longer be marooned in Russia. And so we continue. This is, Simon Rosenberg. He's part of this new Democrat coalition that was founded in 1996. The Clinton Democrats, the people who have held back progress more than a lot of other groups in this country in the past 20 years, the people who are responsible for the Democratic National Convention this past week, which is really a Republican light convention, which has been put on. And here he is saying it's hard to put into words how fucking batshit crazy this is. And I actually would agree that he is projecting and must be talking about himself and the other people who are reacting to Snowden, because actually, they're the ones that are being batshit crazy. And then here is Mark Zaid. And Mark Zaid's a figure that is important for people to know because he exists as a whistleblower attorney in DC. He's completely brainwashed by Beltway ideology about what is the right way and the wrong way to run, the right way and the wrong way to blow the whistle. Thank you, Love Bazaar, for watching the show. And so Mark Zaid, is someone who is constantly on Twitter, if you look at his feed, lecturing other whistleblowers about the right way to blow the whistle, and not a fan of whistleblowers who go to the press and expose abuse and corruption in that manner. He would prefer people go through proper channels and get crushed. There is complete ignorance on the part of people who suggest that Edward Snowden could have gone through these channels internally in order to blow the whistle on all of this, because two things would have happened. One, he would have gone and brought that information. It would have been validated. He would have been told it has to remain private because it's highly classified. He wouldn't have any way to reveal it publicly to us. We would not know the extent to which global mass surveillance was taking place in our country's name against countries around the world and against us, and in violation of our privacy on our internet communications, our phone communications, etc. Or he could have gone to the Inspector General with all of this information, and that Inspector General has said, his name was George Ellard. He was actually thrown out for retaliation against a whistleblower, but he was someone who admitted that if Snowden came to him, he would have told him that he was wrong to think this way about the material he was reading. I documented that. I covered a talk that he gave at Georgetown Law University. I recorded him and released that audio. You could go listen to it at some point. And it rebuts everything that we're hearing about Edward Snowden and how he could have just gone through the channels, because these are people in the Inspector General's office that wouldn't have been on Edward Snowden's side, and frankly might have doubted that he was going to keep this all private and gone to the Justice Department to put him under investigation, because that has happened. That has happened to people. It happened to NSA whistleblowers, Thomas Drake, Kirk Wiebe, Bill Binney, and Ed Loomis, who revealed information back in the early 2000s related to the sweeping up and the hoovering up of our communications after the 9/11 attacks. And so this is Mark Zaid, and he represents partisan whistleblowers, people who suit the Democratic Party that will go against Donald Trump, but he's not for Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden is not a legitimate whistleblower to him. And then we've got this thread, which I wanted to bring up and raise as I wrap this show for this week, which, this is Joshua Geltzer. He used to be in the Justice Department. He was part of the Obama administration. He was involved in this national security law. He has this thread, playing three-dimensional chess with Donald Trump here, saying, why is Trump talking about pardoning Snowden? It's important to understand what Trump's up to if we're going to react responsibly. And first, Trump simply wants to distract by changing the subject, as he so often does. So there's COVID deaths, there's voter suppression, there's so much bad for Donald Trump, and he wants a topic change. Well, he didn't really succeed in changing the topic because he left it hanging as to whether he's going to take any further action. But, continue with your documentation of this grand conspiracy on the part of Donald Trump. Snowden's narrative is Trump's in a sense. It's all about distrusting U.S. intelligence and law enforcement, portraying them as the enemy. This is Trump's whole obsession with 2016 counterintelligence work, Flynn, etc. This is the problem. This is Geltzer. He's one of the elites, a neoliberal who believes that the way to oppose Donald Trump is to protect national security institutions from being undermined and attacked by Donald Trump. And the way to beat Trumpism to him is to protect national security institutions. And you can't support Edward Snowden because he made us doubt the integrity of our U.S. national security institutions. Snowden exposed the way in which they were violating our privacy systematically. And that was validated by a commission that Obama appointed. He should know that. And it was validated by the fact that a federal court and an appeals court ruled that there was unconstitutional collection of records happening by the NSA. And so he should know that this isn't just that it aligns. This isn't like a guilt by association kind of a thing where the Venn diagram, the circles intersect. And so now Snowden and Trump have a shared interest. That's just an effort to discredit Snowden and tar him with this idea that he's somehow, associated with Donald Trump. Third, Snowden divides and polarizes Americans. It's not actually really true because The Economist in 2017 did a poll that found that around 29% of people supported the prosecution. Only 29% support prosecuting Edward Snowden. There was a reluctance to give him a pardon, but there's many people who believe that we should go back, maybe abandon this, find some way to resolve this so that it doesn't continue to hang. And this idea that Trump is using Snowden as a foil to polarize us should be turned back around on these elites. Why should Democrats cede ground to Donald Trump and the right-wing faction of people who want him to be reelected? Why should we let them be the people who get to posture as individuals who care about civil liberties? They are disingenuous. They aren't going to rein in the powers of this government. All of this is cynical on the part of people who talk about liking Edward Snowden. And, that's where I think, there's some validity to this idea that he would be doing it because he was investigated. He was put under an investigation by the Senate and the House, and Robert Mueller put this investigation into play. And they never validated this conspiracy theory that was pushed that the Vladimir Putin and the Russian government were somehow working through the Trump administration to institute policy in the United States. That was not borne out. And so then it got reduced to there was some collusion with the Trump campaign and the goalposts moved. And then now you've got an investigation that's exposing corruption in the way the investigation was carried out. And you have an FBI lawyer or a person who has pled guilty to manipulating the information behind the material that was used to get the warrant against Carter Page. And you see that I think it's possible Trump could end up connecting what has happened to people who were associates of his back to Snowden, saying that, Snowden revealed that we give the FISA court and we give the FBI and we give these agencies too much power to engage in these investigations, to target us through surveillance, and that might need to be reined in. Of course, it's also possible that he could hear from other people who give him reasons to defend the massive surveillance apparatus. It's not like he has been completely opposed to the national security estate during his time in office over the last 4 years. So anyways, here you have Geltzer concluding that we need to stay focused on the deaths and authoritarianism and various Trump misdeeds that must stay front and center. But let's also understand what Trump's doing so we can thwart it and get ahead of him. There's nothing to thwart. There's nothing going on here that needs to be completely unraveled and stopped. It's just the case really that Donald Trump is searching for something that could possibly give him a boost in poll in one day, but it's not going to be enough. And I don't want to get into politics here. That's not really what this show is for. It's about focusing on whistleblowers. So if you want my commentary, you can find other programs for that. But what I will say is this is not a Republican issue. There are the ACLU. There were liberals who believed that Edward Snowden made meaningful contributions to our understanding. And then they've been sucked into this whole idea that because he's been in Moscow all this time, that there's no way he would be allowed to stay there since 2013 without being some kind of agent of Russia. But they have absolutely no evidence for this. And also, the fact is that Edward Snowden is someone who has bettered our understanding of mass surveillance and deserves to be respected and defended for it. But the last thing I want to say before I wrap is that we've seen in the past week, the Justice Department has escalated its efforts. And I don't know if this is spurred by the fact that Donald Trump is talking about potentially pardoning Snowden. So we've seen recently that the Justice Department is making a big deal out of the fact that Snowden has brought in more than $1.2 million in speaking fees since he blew the whistle on all of this. And of course, they tried to shut down his ability, and I think they were successful in getting an advance on his book, Permanent Record, which was his memoir going into why he blew the whistle on this mass surveillance. It went a long way towards introducing his story to the wider public so that he was not this boogeyman figure anymore. And the U.S. government is working on seizing those profits from his book, and now they're going after the speaking engagements he's done. He's had a total of 67 engagements from 2015 to May this year, according to The Guardian. There was a speech that he gave and he's been speaking to any places that will have him, and these are substantial speaking fees, a way to bring in some income while he's in Moscow and isolated. And so I say good for him that he's finding those jobs. Those jobs are hard to come by. When you are a target and seen as an enemy of this, that in effect makes you unemployable. And what they are doing to Edward Snowden is trying to make it so that he can't survive at all, and he can't bring in any money. And they want him to surrender and give up and beg for mercy, beg to be brought back to the United States, and maybe even beg for some kind of plea deal that won't be a deal. And then this would all maybe go away for the government, and they won't have to deal with him anymore. And the fact that he's still out there and in Russia. There was a story about him being paid $35,000 to discuss Bitcoin. That's part of the speaking fees. Again, like, you get creative. You try to find any ways that you can bring in money, because the whole point of the war on whistleblowers is to destroy you and make it impossible for you to work. So, and then they put out these headlines and they make you seem kind of kooky because Bitcoin is still seen like a fringe thing, even though it's been incorporated into a lot of facets of our society and life rather quickly. But that's used to marginalize you, and they know what they're doing. They're trying to run out of clock so that Edward Snowden turns around and comes back to the United States. And so I think it would be there's two things I would have to say. That I think that it would be a good thing if Edward Snowden was granted a pardon, but also I would connect that to what the Justice Department is doing to prosecute Julian Assange in the UK and extradite him, bring him to the United States, and put him on trial, because they are actually going after Assange and unnamed co-conspirators for helping Edward Snowden leave Hong Kong and get on a flight. And then, of course, that flight stopped in Moscow, and then he got off and he was trapped in Moscow and unable to fly because his passport was revoked. I mean, again, for all the people who are fans of this new Cold War paradigm, he did not choose to directly go to Moscow. And he also, by the way, had no documents. All of those were given to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and other journalists, and he did not take copies with him to Russia. So I think it'd be good if he got a pardon, and I think it would be good if the Justice Department, if Donald Trump had his Justice Department and the investigation, the prosecution against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and if he could see to it as being tied to the whole Russiagate scandal that has been a Democratic and Republican ploy to box in his administration and prevent him from going in certain directions with his foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. I think that might be something he could do to find a way out politically. But again, I refrain from politics. Let's keep it about the whistleblowers on this show, and the politics will be on other programs. So that does it for this week's show. We spent a long time on one single story, but most of the time when I have Brian as a person who can help me navigate these stories, I go through several whistleblower stories from the past week. There are stories that I'm covering every week with the Substack letter, which is what's down there. The dissenter.substack.com/subscribe is the place to go to get that. We're offering 30-day free trials right now if you would like to get that newsletter. And if you subscribe to it and get the exclusive material, you're going to be funding my work. You'll be funding the reporting that I plan to do on Julian Assange's case in the UK. There's a major hearing that is upcoming. If it's held, we don't know. There's COVID-19 that's spiking in Europe. Stay tuned for more details. But this newsletter is also used to fund the freelance journalism that we publish at shadowproof.com, and to do the kind of work that goes beyond just covering whistleblowers, but creating space for dissent and having wider spaces for discourse and political conversation. You know, right now we see it tightening and getting very narrow. That happens every 4 years during presidential elections. Anybody who isn't in this box having the conversations that elites demand that we have is seen as somehow a spoiler or undermining their team and their effort to get elected. So if you're not, saying what should be said, you're working against Joe Biden's election, or if you're not saying what needs to be said, they might accuse you of undermining Trump's reelection. And this is about expanding this show so that we talk about the issues that are concerning to struggles for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice. And ultimately, we need your support in order to keep this show going. So thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week with another show.